The most closely related presidents are the father-son pairs, the Bushes and the Adams, and then the grandfather-grandson pair, the Harrisons. The two Roosevelt presidents also share a relation, though not as close. They were fifth cousins from separate branches of the prominent Roosevelt family centered in New York. Theodore Roosevelt, who served as the 26th president, was 24 years older than Franklin, who would serve as the 32nd president. By the time Franklin was 10 years old, Theodore already had 4 children and had served in 3 public offices. This isn't to say, however, the two had no relationship. As a child, Franklin admired his cousin. He looked forward to going over Theodore's estate, where he and his cousin's children engaged in horseback riding, swimming, and hiking. This served as an escape from his quiet life in Hyde Park. Theodore once told Franklin's mother, "I'm so fond of that boy, I'd be shot for him." While they were often busy with their own families, their paths would occasionally cross. When Franklin was a teenager, Theodore spoke at his boarding school. Theodore, however, was always much closer to another Roosevelt, the one Franklin would end up marrying. Eleanor was the 5th cousin once removed of Franklin, and the favorite niece of Theodore. Upon learning of Franklin and Eleanor's engagement, then-President Theodore wrote a letter to Franklin. "Dear Franklin, we are greatly rejoiced over the good news. I am as fond of Eleanor as if she were my daughter, and I like you, and trust you, and believe in you. No other success in life, not the presidency or anything else, begins to compare with the joy and happiness that come in and from the love of the true man and the true woman, the love which never sinks lover and sweetheart in man and wife. You and Eleanor are true and brave, and I believe you love each other unselfishly, and golden years open before you. May all good fortune attend you both ever." Eleanor and Theodore had always shared a special relationship. When Eleanor was 8, she lost her mother, and then her father at age 10. She was ostracized by other members of the family for being an ugly duckling, her plain dress and manners, and inability to fit in with the other girls. This all strengthened her attachment and admiration for Uncle Theodore. Despite being president at the time, Theodore was able to attend the wedding, where he gave the bride away. "Here's to Franklin, for keeping the name in the family," Theodore toasted in his notoriously high-pitched voice. After the ceremony, Theodore headed to the dining room, where he was followed by the guest. Some late-comers to the wedding noted the newlyweds sitting alone outside, while Theodore was holding everyone's attention. As Theodore's daughter Alice later noted, her father wanted to be the bride at every wedding, the baby at every christening, the corpse at every funeral. Franklin was irked by this, but Eleanor didn't seem to mind. Unlike other presidential families, such as the Harrisons and the Bushes, Theodore and Franklin weren't part of the same political party. The Hyde Park Roosevelts, Franklin's side of the family, were Democrats, and Theodore's side, the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, were Republicans. Nevertheless, Franklin and Theodore shared many of the same political sentiments. They were both progressive thinkers with a focus on reform. In 1904, Franklin voted for Theodore over his Democratic rival, Alton Parker. "My father and grandfather were Democrats," Franklin later explained, "and I was born and brought up a Democrat. But in 1904, when I cast my first vote for a president, I voted for the Republican candidate, Theodore Roosevelt, because I felt he was a better Democrat than the Democratic candidates." When Franklin attended Harvard, he briefly attended the Republican Club so he could campaign for Theodore. Franklin would need to overcome this association later, as he was suspected of being a Republican plant within the Democratic Party. In the 1912 election, Franklin voted for progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson rather than his cousin, who was then running as a member of the Progressive Party. This turned some in the family against him, but Theodore never let it hurt their relationship. Franklin wasn't merely inspired by Theodore's ideals, but also his methods of achieving these ideals. He admired Theodore's use of the presidency as the bully pulpit, something which prior presidents hadn't capitalized on. In regards to pursuing reform, Theodore directly advised Franklin, telling him to be cautious and to go for small victories so not to tank his political career. His rise in politics mirrored Theodore's, first taking local positions in New York districts and then becoming Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Theodore wrote to Franklin, "It is interesting to see that you are in another place which I myself once held." In the 1920 presidential election, Franklin, age 36, was nominated as Democrat James M. Cox vice presidential candidate. 20 years prior, Theodore, age 42, was nominated as the vice presidential candidate to Republican William McKinley. The following year, Theodore would assume the presidency after McKinley's assassination. In 1932, 12 years after being nominated as vice president, Franklin would win the presidency himself. Theodore would never live to see his cousin's presidency, or for that matter, his 1920 vice presidential try. He died in 1919. He spent his final years dealing with many personal hardships. His request to fight in World War I was denied by President Wilson, and his health was beginning to decline. However, the most crushing blow came when his youngest son, Quentin, was killed in combat in July 1918. During the last years of his life, Theodore didn't have much interaction with his cousin. He was only 60 when he died. Though Theodore was gone, Franklin would continue to be inspired by his example. He capitalized on the Roosevelt name and his cousin's policies. Historians have even considered Theodore's 1912 New Nationalism speech to be the inspiration for Franklin's New Deal. The New Nationalism speech had talked of the Square Deal. "I stand for the Square Deal, but when I say that I am for the Square Deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play under the present rules of the game, but that I stand for having those rules changed as to work for a more substantial equality of opportunity and of reward for equally good service." Despite Franklin's admiration for his cousin, Theodore's death would mark a divide in the family. Roosevelts from the Oyster Bay branch had tried to distance themselves from Franklin as he rose to power. They claimed he didn't represent the family name. Theodore's Republican children, Theodore III and Alice, were particularly antagonistic. In 1940, Alice even said she'd rather vote for Hitler than for Franklin. 26 years after Theodore's death, Franklin would also suffer an early death at age 63. He died just months into his fourth presidential term due to mounting health problems. If you enjoyed this video, consider viewing the United States History Facts playlist. Currently, it contains over 40 videos on presidents from John Adams to Abraham Lincoln to Franklin Roosevelt. Also, consider subscribing and donating on Patreon. Patreon link in the description below.